Hey, this is Dave jumping on at the beginning here. Hope you're doing well. I have another podcast called the How to Podcast series, and I had an author on to talk about his book, and I wanted to share with you here as well because I think you as an author could benefit from this. And his book is called The Business of Podcasting, How to Take Your Podcasting Passion from the Personal to the Professional. His name is Steve Lubetkin, and he also wrote this book alongside with Donna Papacosta. And this book is a great beginning overview of podcasting. It'll give you some history. It'll give you the technical terms and all the information without going super nerdy, which I appreciate. And Steve came on the podcast to talk about the book, to talk about podcasting and his background, and to kind of give us a sense of where podcasting is going in the future. I wanted to share this episode with you because I think podcasting would be a great addition to whatever your plans are after your book is done and you're ready to go out and either start a show, which I could help you with, by the way, or if you want to be a guest on a podcast. It's great for you to promote your book and get out there in front of people. So without further delay, co-written with Donna Papacosta, this is Steve Lubetkin right here on Living the Next Chapter. And you're Steve right now.
But they also had a place where they trained people for the Armed Forces Radio Network to be on the radio. And my dad got me into the radio station training studio one afternoon as a teenager. And when I came out of the studio, I knew that radio was where I wanted to try and spend my life. And I came home and started making pretend radio shows in my parents' basement with a reel-to-reel tape recorder, a microphone, and a turntable, a vinyl turntable. And at the time, you're talking about the early 70s, the only real way to distribute it was to drag my best friend into the basement to play chess and play back the shows for him on the tape recorder.
Okay, everyone, welcome back. I have a gentleman here with me today that I've been enjoying this book that sort of showed up in my mailbox, The Business of Podcasting, How to Take Your Podcasting Passion from the Personal to the Professional. Co-author on this book, Steve Lubetkin, is here with me, and Steve brings history to our podcast, many years in the business of podcasting, a great voice in podcasting, a great advocate for podcasting, and I have the chance to sit and talk with Steve today, so I am thrilled to have time with you, Steve. Thank you for the book, and thank you for making time to be with me.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for having me, Dave.
It's excellent. Tell me a little bit about the story behind the book. When it came out, and there's so much good stuff in here. I'd love to get into that today.
Sure. So it goes back to actually around 2006, 2007, when I connected with my co-author, Donna Papacosta, who had been a podcaster and podcast producer out of Toronto, Canada. And we met online through social media initially, and then around 2007, there was a new media expo conference in California where we finally met face to face and connected over, beers and conversations about podcasting and all kinds of sessions. And, we stayed in touch over the years, and Donna and I had a similar experience with podcasting. She contacted me and said, I have this idea for a book, and described her idea. And I said, that is perfect because I'm experiencing the same thing. And what we were both experiencing was there were people, pretty much everybody in the podcasting space, hoping that they would become rich and famous through podcasting, either by being a podcast host or by becoming so popular that they could sell commercials on their podcast, or that people would just love them so much that they would sell subscriptions to their podcasts. And both of us had tried all of these various models for making money from podcasting, and none of them were working for us. And the one model that was consistently working for both of us was producing podcasts for clients. And I had found, and Donna had found, it was difficult to find people to work with because most of the podcasters who were working in the early days were hobbyists primarily, and hadn't thought about it in terms of, I need to be portable, I need to have equipment that I can take with me to do podcasting on location, which is now ubiquitous. Everybody has some kind of gear they can take with them to record interviews on location, whether they go to a conference or whatever. But at the time, I found myself double booked at one point where 2 clients wanted me to record podcasts for them in 2 separate locations on the same day at the same time. And I reached out to some of my podcasting friends, and the response was, well, I guess I could unplug my big tower computer and put it in my car and take it to where the podcast is and plug in my USB microphone. And I'm thinking to myself, this is not the right model. You need to have a go bag full of broadcast recording equipment that you can just take with you in the car. And that's when we got the idea that we would argue in favor of, hey, the business of podcasting is not about becoming rich and famous from selling your podcast. It's from selling your podcasting services to clients who will pay you to help them produce podcasts.
Okay. And your history in podcasting goes way back to the beginning of time of podcasting. Tell me a little bit about how podcasting came onto your radar early on.
Sure. I joke with people that I started podcasting when I was a teenager in high school. And obviously you can see that I predate the traditional marking of the start of the podcast era by my age. When I was a teenager, I lived in central New Jersey, and my father worked at a military base there, which was the primary training center for the U.S. Army's Signal Corps, which was responsible for all the communications in the Army. And it had dated back all the way from carrier pigeons in World War I to radar and satellite uplinks in the 60s and 70s. And they taught everything there, including teaching military personnel how to produce radio and TV broadcasts. And they had a very sophisticated closed-circuit TV system on the base. But they also had a place where they trained people for the Armed Forces Radio Network to be on the radio. And my dad got me into the radio station training studio one afternoon as a teenager. And when I came out of the studio, I knew that radio was where I wanted to try and spend my life. And I came home and started making pretend radio shows in my parents' basement with a reel-to-reel tape recorder, a microphone, and a turntable, a vinyl turntable. And at the time, you're talking about the early 70s, the only real way to distribute it was to drag my best friend into the basement to play chess and play back the shows for him on the tape recorder. And he was patient and he listened, and we laughed about it. But a couple of years later, when I went to college, the college had a radio station. And that was literally my first stop on campus. And they said, you can have a radio show if you can pass the radio license exam from the FCC. And I got my, this is the U.S. Federal Communications Commission. At the time, you had to get a license to be on the air and to sign the logs that we kept for the transmitter. So we had to trek up to New York City for that and pass the test. And once you got your license, you got to go on the air. And I did that in college. And a good friend of mine who I'm still in touch with was working for the local newspaper, which owned a radio station. And he was chatting up the station manager, got himself a job doing commercial production, voicing commercials, and got me in the door as a production engineer and then later as a newscaster. So that was the beginning of the commercial radio career. It didn't pay much, and it still doesn't. So you have a choice between being on the radio and buying groceries, and I chose buying groceries. So after a few years in radio and print journalism, I moved over to corporate PR, and I did public relations in the corporate world for a long time. And it was when I exited there that I was casting about for what to do next when I left the corporate world. And my initial plan was, I had a lot of years of experience counseling corporate executives about their public relations, their communications. But you're also in competition with a lot of big firms. There's a lot of big public relations agencies who can literally put boots on the ground all over the world. And if you're a sole proprietor, a single practitioner, it's kind of hard to compete with that. Yeah. Right around that time, my wife heard one of the early features on National Public Radio, the American equivalent of, I guess, the CBC. And it was about podcasting. And she said, you have this radio experience. You really should look at this podcasting thing. And I listened to the feature that she was listening to. I said, oh my God, this is exactly right. We could do this and we could sell it to corporate clients, but it has to sound good. And the thing that I was experiencing with a lot of podcasts that I was listening to in the early days was people were caught up in a lot of the same things we were caught up in when I was a student broadcaster. You're smitten with the idea that you're talking into a microphone, so you tell people about the microphone. You talk about the buttons you're pushing in the studio, or what
Right.
record you're playing, and it's fun for you and your friends, but it's largely irrelevant to the audience. And I knew that we had to be better than that. It had to sound like NPR or CBC in order for corporate clients to be willing to invest money in it, and it had to sound professional. And I was fortunate that I had the professional radio experience. I was able to, understand the concepts behind editing and pacing and telling a good story. I just didn't have the equipment. So I had to gear up with digital equipment, because my original radio experience took place back in the analog days when recordings were on magnetic recording tape, and
Yep.
editing was done with a razor blade and a grease pencil marking the tape.
Wow.
And I don't know how many of your listeners are old enough to remember those days, but if you made a mark on the tape and cut it with the razor blade, you better be precise, because there's no going back. There's no Control Z in recording tape.
Right.
And so I had to gear up with some digital recording devices and learn digital editing with digital, editing software. It took off from there. A couple of people approached me who knew that I was doing it and wanted podcasts. We started doing audio podcasts initially, and after a couple of years, people started asking for video. And today, most of what we do is video, and then with the audio option, we typically will record client programs as a video podcast. And then, once we lock down the video timeline, we export it to audio and deliver that as an audio podcast as well. And so
Nice.
It's been 18 years.
Wow. 18 years.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Wow.
It's the longest job I've held in my life. I tell people I work for a real idiot, but I know how to manage him.
I love it. Because the one thing I hear a lot, Steve, is new people coming into podcasting, brand new. They have no idea of the history of podcasting, and they come into podcasting and think, "Wow, this is hard." There's so much to do, and I'm thinking, we need some perspective. We need to know what it was like for those that created podcasting for us, and those pioneers that helped get us to where we are today. And I want to remind people that it was harder. It was harder at a certain point in time than it is today to start a podcast. There's a lot of behind the scenes work you had to do to get your voice out into the world, where now it's pretty well easier to get your voice out into the world through a podcast with all the great tools that are available to us. So I want to give people history, bring history back into podcasting, and understand and appreciate all the people that have come before us that have made it the way it is now.
Well, it's true. And, back in the early days, internet bandwidth was one of the biggest problems, because nobody had high-speed broadband to the extent that we have it today. So even just uploading a finished podcast could be a chore, and people kept them very short. I remember early on doing a podcast from a conference that the conference went on for 2.5 hours. It was a very large file by the standards of the time, and uploading it and wondering who was going to download this enormous 2.5 hour podcast. And yet, because of the subject matter, people did download it. But, we should definitely pay homage to the people who started podcasting for us, which would be Adam Curry and Dave Weiner. Most people know that Adam Curry was a VJ on MTV back in the days when, MTV actually played music. I saw a joke on Facebook the other day. Somebody said, MTV is 42 years old. Let's celebrate the 15 years of music they gave us. Adam went off and collaborated with Dave Weiner, and Dave Weiner, of course, the developer of the RSS technology that everybody uses for the feed. And they collaborated on designing into the feed the tag called enclosure, which allows people to point to large files like audio and video without actually sending them to people. I know when we were talking last week, we talked about Pointcast back in the mid-90s. A company called Pointcast came out with what was sort of the first effort at delivering multimedia content to people for free over the internet. But the model they chose was to make people download a specialized receiver piece of software, and then send that receiver large blobs of multimedia data, audio and video, several times a day. And what happened there was corporate internet connections got blocked. They just got flooded with these blobs of multimedia, and so IT directors at most corporations shut down. They blocked Pointcast programmatically from their firewalls and destroyed its business model literally overnight. So obviously people needed to look for a different way to do it. And, hanging audio and video on a website seemed like a good idea. And, when we first started, there weren't even content platforms like Libsyn and Blueberry. There, you put your audio files up on your web hosting company, and all of a sudden you realized that you couldn't put anything up on your website because you had filled up your quota. Because in the early days, web companies didn't give you very large quotas for your website because they didn't contemplate large audio files. And, at that time, we weren't even considering video, but, it was a challenge, and it's gotten easier. But people are always looking for I don't have to learn anything solution to doing stuff. And I think it's unfortunate to some extent. Some of the companies that are providing really good tools in this area are also, I don't want to say misleading people, but letting people think that they can just push a button, and when they push the stop button, they're done. That, you can just, record a Zoom or record on one of the other platforms and then just take that and put it up. And people are discovering it's not quite that simple. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in post-production to make it look right. And it's a question of whether people want it to look right too.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's it's great that podcasting is easier than it was originally, but it's also a downfall in the sense that, again, people don't understand or respect the medium, understand the audience and what the audience is looking for. Because as you scroll through your app listening to podcasts, you're up against some really highly produced, well-created podcasts with a team and resources and money behind their show. And there you are in the mix. And you want to make yourself sound as good as possible. So from your perspective, for new podcasters, leveraging tools, which is great, but what are some really common things that as podcasters we need to do to sound better and set ourselves apart as a podcast?
Well, I think, learning how to use editing tools effectively. I mean, as you pointed out, you're up against some very well-financed professional broadcasters who are now, people tend to think of the very popular podcast Serial as a podcast, that was distributed by National Public Radio here in the U.S. They think of it as a podcast, and what you're really talking about is a professionally produced radio series. It was produced in an NPR studio in Chicago with a staff of, writers and producers and audio editors and researchers. With all due respect to how wonderful it was, Sarah Koenig was not sitting on the floor in her basement with a USB mic plugged into her laptop. Okay. There was a lot of professional support for the program. And the only difference between that and All Things Considered, the daily news feature show on NPR, is they chose not to put Serial on the satellite to the stations. They put it up on the internet. It's a professionally produced radio show, and every professional broadcaster has the ability to produce really high quality podcasts simply by exporting their already well-produced TV and radio shows to the appropriate file to put on the internet. And so that's what you're up against, and you need to kick up the game. And that means learning how to edit for pacing, taking the right audio clips. It's okay to edit out the hesitations, when people are looking for the answer at the beginning, when they say, well, so let me say about that. You can take that out, and you can get a much tighter piece of audio or video if you edit out the fillers. I'm not saying you take out every and but and sometimes you do, but you can learn how to pace the story better. You can learn how to level the sound. One of the things I hear a lot in podcasts is people not understanding the importance of making sure the volume levels of all the speakers are matched. And that requires extra work. I mean, when we do a video with multiple speakers on it, even though the editing tools for audio in the video program that we use Adobe Premiere, are very good, we still export the audio to Adobe Audition to do the fine tuning and to make sure everything is matched up. And then we bring the audio back into the video timeline so that we get a nice clean piece of audio. It's helpful to be able to isolate microphones, and understanding how to do that. muting the people who are not talking so that you don't get the barking dog in the background. All those things are important. And, just using broadcast techniques to make it look and sound as good as you can, because your competition is doing that.
Yeah, and I want to touch on pacing a little bit more as well. I did an episode recently where I was a guest on a show. They put the finished podcast through an editing software, which basically erased every pause, every silence, and put the words really close together. So there was no thoughtful gallop to my voice. There was no thoughtful pauses. Everything was just really, really short and very compact. And I felt anxious listening to this recording because it didn't sound human to me. So talk about pacing and what that really means in podcasting, what we can do better around pacing.
That sounds a lot like the tool that the advertisers use when they have to get in the legal disclaimers at the end of a 30-second commercial, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are places where that's probably an appropriate use of that technology. I do a daily internet streaming radio newscast that with the friend who got me my first job in commercial radio is still doing his radio show on the internet. And occasionally, if we run, in the 3-minute newscast runs 3:05, I'll use that tool to compress it down, and it's hardly noticeable when you do something like that. But, doing it for an entire conversation for a long recording is probably just somebody taking the easy way out, right? They're trying to they think that just by pushing a button, and there are a lot of tools that let you do this. There are editing tools where you get a transcript and you're editing the podcast from the transcript. And so it lets you go through the transcript and say, take out every pause or take out every time the person says or and the software will do that. It just doesn't sound natural. And so, I'm old school in that respect. I believe that you're better off editing the audio rather than editing the transcript. What I do use transcripts for is when I'm trying to build a script for, say, a documentary style production. I generally don't write the script and try to find interview clips that will fit the script. You conduct the interviews first and see where they take the story. And when you interview 3 or 4 people over time, you start to see a pattern emerge in the conversation, and the same themes will come up in each of those conversations on the topic. And that sort of infuses your scripting so that you can write a script that fits with what they're saying rather than writing a script and then having them say what fits the script, right? So, and it's helpful to be able to find those things now. We used to have to do that by taking notes, and now we can do it by just having an automatic transcript created to find keywords and passages. So that's a lot easier, but it's an important process, and it's time consuming. And frankly, I think a lot of people think they can get away without investing that time, and that's kind of why you get the effect that you're describing. If you listen to what the person's saying, and particularly for something where you're trying to build drama in a narrative podcast or a storytelling podcast, and there are a lot of them about, say, unsolved crimes, you want the witnesses' testimony to, take place in chunks, so you can intersperse it with spooky music and sound effects and things. And so you need to learn how to break those things up and have them take place in a more leisurely fashion rather than trying to rush everything and get out all of the gaps. The gaps are important. There's a message in those gaps, and particularly when people are talking about something that is personal to them or emotional to them, that's part of the drama of the sound, and it's important to be able to understand that.
Yeah, I'm a musician, and one of the things I've always said is the magic is in between the notes.
Oh, sure.
In music, right?
Absolutely.
Those little pauses and how you do that really lends itself to the music. So bring that into your podcasting. Where do you see podcast going? What's exciting you about the new things happening in podcasting and some of the big players that are getting into podcasting and promoting podcasting as well? We have YouTube and all these things promoting podcasting. What's exciting for you as you kind of see this over the 18 years you've been involved? What's coming that just catches your interest?
Well, I think, the tools that are available today are so much more sophisticated than the tools that were available back then. The platforms that are available to get high quality recordings of all of the participants. There is a freelance job in the audio and video business called tape sync, where a broadcast outlet wants to interview someone at a distant location, and they will send a sound engineer or a film crew to that location to interview the person, basically stick a camera or microphone in their face, while the producer back at the studio with the anchor person interviews them over Zoom or over the telephone. And those two recordings are put together back in the studio to make it look like they were having the conversation in one kind of broadcast space, if you will, like we're doing now. Mm-hmm. And for years, that was an exclusively in-person kind of a technology. You sent an engineer with a microphone and a recorder to the location. And what we've been able to do with Zoom and with Riverside and Squadcast and Zencaster is basically replicate that double ender or tape sync environment without having to send somebody there. So it makes it a lot easier for, a podcaster sitting in Kansas City to interview somebody in a distant location. And we've done podcasts with people all over the world. And, because of these tools, we can get high quality, broadcast quality video that looks like, we're talking in the same studio. So it's just really become extremely flexible and easy to do. And the barriers to entry continue to lower. Over the past few years, the live streaming video switching capabilities have become even better. And we've been taking advantage of things like vMix, the video software for live streaming and live production. We use for a lot of recorded productions. We've used it for live streams, both on location and in our studio. And we've used things like StreamYard, and we've used Vimeo Live, which gives you just the flexibility to put on these, large scale broadcasts that before were just out of reach financially for most people. So, I think those things are exciting. I think artificial intelligence is going to have a role in helping us do the research and helping us create some of the graphics. I hope it doesn't replace you and me, because I think there's some value to having real humans hosting these things. And I say that a little selfishly, but also, I think there's a credibility factor. I think if everything becomes, artificial or generated by a computer, it ceases to be something that people are going to look at. They're going to treat it as if it's like, oh, it's another, TV commercial. I mean, so many TV commercials look alike. You're seeing this in the music business. There was a great article not too long ago. I think it was it's either the Atlantic or the New Yorker magazine, about why baseball and music have become so successful, but also so boring. And a lot of it has to do with the computer models that they're using. We go back to the movie Moneyball, and the baseball team owners and coaches figured out the mathematical model for the best or most profitable baseball team is not necessarily for a winning team. And the combination of players that it tells them to put together, and I'm not a sports person, and if I get this wrong, please don't send me hate mail. But the mathematical model leads to games that go on for a long time, and there's not a lot of exciting stuff going on because people are just trying to get certain types of hits. They're not swinging for the fences. And the same thing's happening in the music business. They have algorithms that know what songs and what its song sounds like that's going to be a potential hit, and they make the songs all sound like that hit. And so that's why, if you listen randomly to songs that are on the top 10 list, you hear a lot of songs that have similar characteristics. They don't sound exactly alike, but they have similar characteristics because they're programmed to be put together that way. And, there's a spontaneity that comes from the human factor that, I think we need to preserve somehow. But for doing routine tasks like writing show notes or creating transcripts, I mean, it's valuable as long as you have a human eye looking at it.
Yeah, and the one thing I'm reading through your book, you take us back, you explain many of the early days of podcasting. You talk about RSS feeds, and for people who don't know what that is, that's maybe something we need to talk about in the future more. But I'd love to get your take on the health of RSS from your perspective, because I'm seeing alternatives to RSS in the fact like YouTube now saying that we have podcasts on YouTube, and it's not the traditional RSS feed that we're so used to using as podcasters, or podcasters that are only on one app. So like a Joe Rogan, where it's only on Spotify and is not available in other places. RSS was meant to be free and open, easily shared across multiple devices, accessed by anyone. So can you give me a little sense of how you feel the RSS feed is right now? Is it healthy? Is it growing? Is there a change coming that you feel?
I think it's an essential piece of the podcasting ecosystem for people who are not tied to a specific media company like a Joe Rogan. Okay.
Yeah.
Most of us do not have a distributor who's going to, be the sole distributor of our content. We need to be on as many platforms as possible. You can do it one at a time, but that's really time consuming. The better approach has always been to subscribe. And here again, this is, the shortcut that a lot of people think they can take. They get sucked into you can put your podcasts on our platform for free. And they assume that they don't have to pay for a platform to host their podcasts until they find out that there's a limit to the number of podcasts they can put up on that platform, or the number they can have in archive, or the length of the podcast, or how many downloads they are allowed to have before they hit a wall where they're asked to pay. What we found from the very beginning, because we were dealing with corporate clients who expected their podcasts to be available when they wanted them to be, is you really should pay for a content platform, whether it's Libsyn, Liberated Syndication, or Blueberry, or Podbean, or any of the others. They're all perfectly fine. They all have different aspects that people like or prefer. But you should pay for a platform that's going to allow you to post your podcasts, keep them in archive as long as you're paying for your subscription, and make them always available. And then generate an RSS feed from that platform that can be submitted automatically and programmatically by the platform to all of the podcasting directories, whether it's Spotify or Google Podcasts or Amazon or Apple. And you don't have to do more than changing parameters in the content platform. It's a real time suck to have to go out and, I have to change my feed on Spotify. We never do that kind of thing. We generate the feed from the content platform, and then we actually use that feed within the client's website, and typically generate the final feed that goes out to the podcast world from the website. You get in the directories from the content platform, but the feed you want people picking up is the feed coming out of your website, so that, they're getting your stuff, your client's content, and it's coming to them in a way that you can control. And people have started using YouTube, by the way, to host their podcast. They'll typically take an audio podcast and slap a static title slide on it, and then put it up as a YouTube video. And I guess that's a way of getting some traction. We tend, I just kind of feel that YouTube is for videos, and people are using it more as a podcast search engine, which I guess is functional. But people don't. Even though the conventional wisdom is, that YouTube is the second most used search engine after Google. People are not searching YouTube looking for your podcast. Okay, they're looking for funny videos, or they're looking for how do I repair the leak under my kitchen sink videos.
Right. Yeah,
they're looking for that kind of stuff. And to me, you're better off having really rich content on your website and really good tags on your, the keywords and meta tags on the content so that it's found by the main Google search. Because what people search for is the solution to their problem. And even I tell my corporate clients, they're not searching for your brand name. They're searching for, how do I solve this thing that's keeping me awake at night? And as long as you have the thing that's keeping them awake at night in your metadata, they'll find you.
Yeah.
And they'll find you as a solution to that problem. So I don't think RSS is in any danger of going away. It's a very functional, even if it's not well understood, or well used by a lot of people. It's being used by the professionals. And I don't think it's going to disappear.
It's amazing. Okay. So before we go, Steve, as far your contact information's on the screen with us as we're chatting, but let everybody know how to get in touch with you. I know that you are on many different shows advocating for podcasting and other areas of business as well. You're a great voice for us as podcasters, so thank you for doing that. But where do people get in touch with you and get in contact?
Well, the main website is beingthemedia.com, which just goes to our Lubetkin.net website. It's the same place. We also have our news content subsidiary is statebroadcastnews.com, where we have news and feature shows about current events, all kinds of public affairs, things that are going on in state government, local government, and issues that people are interested in. We've interviewed some interesting people, some celebrities, and they can reach me by just emailing Steve at lmediacos.com, lmediacos.com.
Excellent. And Steve, for the listeners here today, a lot of them are new podcasters, just starting out, brand new to all of this. Any words of wisdom, any encouragement that you can give to a brand new podcaster listening to our conversation today? What can we say to them to encourage them to move forward with their podcast?
Well, I would certainly hope that they would take a look at the book, and they can go to thebusinesofpodcasting.com.
Yes, sir.
It's a great book. It's a couple of years old now, but I think most of the information is useful. It's not about how to podcast. It's important to point that out. It's more about the business model that we think could work for you if you want to make a business out of podcasting. So, nice. We hope people would read it and become professional podcasters.
Excellent. And it is an amazing book. I have it here in my hands. I'm flipping through it as we chat. Great information. A great starting point for anyone. This should be on your bookshelf and be read constantly as you create your podcast. Steve, thank you so much for being part of How to Podcast series. I'm so proud and honored to have you here. So thank you for making time for me. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, David. It's great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Really appreciate you being here and being part of our podcast community. LivingTheNextChapter.com is our website. I have an offer for you as an author, if you're listening, and you're wanting to build your website for your book. I've had so many authors come on and they're struggling in this area. I'd love to help you. All of the websites that I built for my different podcasts, I have experience and I'd love to help you and get you up and running. I can help you with your domain purchase. I can help you with setting up your podcast, making it really simple. And if you love Canva, we can even set it up on Canva for you, and you can do all your own maintenance. You don't need to hire anybody. We'll help you get set up. So if that interests you as an author and you want a website for your book, let me know. We can do this. I can help you. LivingTheNextChapter.com is the website for the podcast. You can find me there. I'd love to help you. Reach out. Let me know if I can be of assistance in any way. And thank you again for listening to Living the Next Chapter. Today is where your book begins. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening.
Mindshift Power Podcast, the podcast for teenagers and those who work with them. There's a huge problem in America today. There's a very large disconnect between teenagers and the adults who work with them. I'm looking to bridge that gap with real, raw, honest conversation, not held back by the chains of political correctness. You cannot solve a problem you do not understand. Want to understand teenagers today? Listen to this podcast. This This podcast is for teens in the U.S. and Canada. To learn more, go to fatimabay.com/podcast or just look for Mindshift Power Podcast on any listening platform. I look forward to you being a faithful listener.